So today we're going to be having a conversation about the evolution of school-based mindfulness research, which is something that Rob is an expert in. And yeah, covering the last 20 years or so, what's happened, what have we learned, what have been the approaches to researching this topic, and where should we go from the future?
Rob, can you just share how you describe the distinction between mindfulness and meditation?
Yes, this is that's such an interesting question, so. And I think meditation refers to, it's like saying sports meditation. Well, which kind? There's so many different varieties for cultivating and developing that birthright gift of being able to be present with a kind of openness and acceptance, a kind of embracing of what's happening. I don't think it will always happen by itself, but I think every person has moments of it. And what we're trying to do is to make it a bit more systematic and stable in our awareness so that it's available in every kind of moment of our life, whether pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral. And so I think meditation is sort of agnostic, and mindfulness is trying to refer to this state. But even that is incomplete, because where is the love and compassion and wisdom in that definition of mindfulness? Right. I can use my mindfulness without love and compassion for all sorts of things. So we want to remember we're talking, I think, in an educational context of an ethical way of being in the world and being present to the relations that sustain us and that created us. That how do we really become a full member, a full human being, and a full member of our community for the good of all. And I think this is what we're trying to do together. This is why wanted to, I love the idea that this group of people is committed to a generational and really probably global change in the way that we form hearts and minds in young people, with the hope that this is the one strategy for changing the trajectory that the world seems to be on around political polarization and ecological devastation and materialism, that there's those that we're trying to change that.
Could you give us just kind of a high level overview of the work that's been done and some of the key findings of that work?
Yes, and I'll just give you a little bit of an origin story that I chant, and it's not the only origin story, as we know. There's diversity in origin stories, but it was at a meeting in 2000 in Dharamsala in the Dalai Lama's living room, which you can read about if you haven't, in a book called Destructive Emotions by Daniel Goleman, where he outlines what happened in this meeting. And during this meeting, the Dalai Lama charged people like Richie Davidson and Mark Greenberg, who've been huge giants in this contemplative education field, to turn the powerful technologies and methodologies and procedures of science that were being used to address problems like anxiety and depression and the like. Could we use those same tools to study how to cultivate compassion, kindness, gratitude, mindful awareness, empathy, and perspective taking? And I think that 2000 marks a kind of origin story point for contemplative education, where that set the wheels in motion for groups like the Garrison Institute, Mind and Life Institute, many, many, many others, too many to name, and I'm sorry if I'm not naming you, to start to think about what would this look like, contemplation in education. And I would say for the next 5 or 10 years, what happened was, could this work? We were trying to be a bit careful. How to do no harm was our first principle and still is in this work. How do we make sure that whatever we're doing, it's not turning young people off to investigating the nature of their minds and their lives? Critical. So how to do this. And while that was happening, of course, the enormous creativity that many of you on the call participated in program development advanced and almost sort of, not almost, got way ahead of the science. And so by 2010, there was a lot of practical implementation of programs, and research was just beginning. on those programs. And I would say since 2010, where you see a real uptick in the number of published studies on mindfulness in education, um, uh, right at that point is where the science started to try to make some sense of what was going on in the field. And so we have about 15 years of scientific research on these programs and practices. And I think there's some really promising and exciting signs, and there's some challenges that are before us as a maturing field that ultimately is interested in the exceedingly hard historical problem of how do you transform education? And that problem is fundamentally, in my view, a problem of embodiment. How do we change the way we interact with each other? Because the widget that is at the heart of the educational enterprise is not a widget, it's human interaction, it's us. And so to change that system is to really change the nature of the routines of teaching and learning. So I think that goes back to you saying how challenging this was. What have we learned in those intervening 15 years? I think we've learned a lot. And of course, whatever I say today should be taken with a grain of salt because no one person can actually know exactly what's happening all over the field. And so my view is actually on a very limited part of the field, which developed with the very pressing question at the beginning that I think we all had was, could this work? I mean, could you actually teach mindfulness or meditation practices to young children? And I'll just note parenthetically, there wasn't really a predicate for this in the Tibetan Buddhist tradition itself of teaching young children meditation. And sometimes even later in monastic life, it's not the staple. And so, so this was quite new. So a lot of the research studies were experimental and tried to look at causal questions of does this create some sort of positive change in educators or students compared to business as usual.
Sure.
And so we really focused on that research. And here's the things I think we've discovered. First, it's incredibly important not to leave out the educators. To be honest, so many educational innovations do that. They're almost teacher proof from the outset, especially when they come from outside the system. And to be honest, and I love SEL and all my friends, for several decades, that was the model, focus on the students. Oh, but now we're really focusing on the adults. I think the mindfulness movement learned from SEL and started in some degree with adults. Really showed that mindfulness training for teachers can help reduce occupational stress and burnout, as well as mental health problems like depression and anxiety in teachers, which are exceedingly high, especially after the pandemic, but even before. I think these practices and programs can even transform, we know, the nature of the interactions teachers have with students as we become more kind to ourselves, clear in our minds, and calm in our bodies. That manifests in our interactions with others. And so we think that the educator focused work can really help teachers to be their best and to transform their classrooms. And the work is now attending to the leaders. Critically important. I'd say that's where the greatest promise of mindfulness in education is. It helps the adults deal with a very high stress relational job.
Yeah.
And
No doubt it seems that the adults there is a power differential in the context of a school where the adults do kind of set the tone, hold the container in a way. So their well-being and regulation abilities and how they're relating to their present moment experience undoubtedly impacts the space just as much as anything that's being taught in a pedagogical sense.
exactly. We sometimes use the phrase the adults create the weather for child development in schools.
Sure.
And so to miss the weather creators is to miss a massive, what we would call indirect intervention. That is, just by intervening with the educators and the leaders, we are creating a different environment for child development. And some of the research shows that without ever going to the kids, the nature of the classroom environment gets better. So I think that's the really good news. I think there's good news on the student front, although I think, to be honest, I think the question of how we can best implement programs for students at different ages from different communities and backgrounds is an open question still. So in 2022, my colleagues and I did some summary of the research for policymakers and ed leaders, and we came down with the idea that if by looking at all the research, we tried to find the best studies, experimental studies with students, and we found evidence that this mindfulness program definitely helps students' self-regulation abilities, the ability to regulate our attention fundamentally, but also our behavior and our emotion. I think the evidence on does it impact mental health is a bit mixed, and we can talk about that. Maybe we've heard of the Myriad study, which is only one, but even before the Myriad study, the evidence was a bit mixed as to whether this could really prevent mental health problems, and much less evidence on can it promote flourishing. So we have a sort of bias in the field towards trying to prevent problems. Good thing, reduce suffering. We have less of a focus in the studies we looked at in terms of cultivating flourishing.
Yeah, and by that you kind of mean I've heard the phrase the betterment of well people. Like it can meet you wherever you're at and make you a healthier, happier person. Is that what you mean by that second part?
Yeah, I think about mental health as having two wings. The absence of different kinds of distress, anxiety, depression, anger, worry. So we want to reduce those. And there's been a real focus on that. And there's been some real promise in that, but it's not across the board. And then, so we want to reduce the absence of distress as part of mental health. And then the presence of well-being is the other wing. This is life satisfaction, gratitude, kindness, generosity, these bouquet of virtues that we're also able to cultivate. We have a little less attention to that, at least in the pre-K to 12 environment.
Sure.
And believe it or not, even less research on does it affect academics? So I think the early research is really trying to focus on, could I implement these programs and would the kids learn some basic skills for learning to regulate their attention and their emotion? And I think there's real promise there and work to be done of how that works out in different places, communities, and different student background groups.
Yeah, so my next question is going to be asking you to reflect on the methodology and the assumptions behind this work over the past 15 years, this research. And feel free to kind of circle back to the Myriad study, which I think probably would be great to kind of give an overview of this on the call. And my question is murky and it's half-baked, so feel free to riff on whatever comes up. But I do have a question if the method of studying perhaps is actually decreasing the quality of the mindfulness the quality of the mindfulness implementation itself. So by, for example, stressing a high fidelity to a particular curriculum where a teacher who may not have that much interest in mindfulness is reading a script, so everyone is making sure to read the same thing, as opposed to the more relational embodied approach where someone who really does know a lot about mindfulness is in the classroom kind of adapting to what's in front of them. Is that potentially at play here and skewing the results in some way?
I think it could be, and I think we are at a moment where we want to encourage methodological diversity in how we try to assess, capture, and understand the impacts of these programs. You know, we live in a time in a system where educational research is funneled into a kind of experimental paradigm where we can look at things causally. And I think that's wonderful, because that's not something we've done traditionally in education, and it matters. So if you know the DARE program, I don't know how many millions of dollars were spent on DARE thinking it would defer people from drug use. And in fact, it had the opposite consequence. No one had ever studied it. And when they finally did, they found out that DARE taught kids about different street drugs they didn't know about, and they may have used drugs a little more. So we want to be sure that what we're doing is having the impact we're having. But there are different ways of knowing and different methodologies for doing that, even if they don't receive value in the culture. So I do think in the Myriad study, one of the things that I've learned about that study, which was a study in Great Britain of about 8,000 students, and I don't have the number, 80 some teachers. Actually, it may have been more teachers, but it was the largest randomized controlled trial of mindfulness for 11 to 14-year-olds ever done. And it was trying to be a primary mental health intervention through the schools to reduce depression and anxiety. One of the decisions they made, they trialed a little program called .B in a study with 9 teachers who were practitioners of mindfulness and found positive benefits of .B on the students' depressive symptoms and other things. And so they thought, let's scale that up and do a much larger study to see if that works at scale. But one of the decisions they made was that none of the teachers who delivered that intervention could practice mindfulness. And so they actually had novice teachers implementing this large scale intervention. They were not necessarily motivated to do this. They were mandated to. And the study showed no impacts, and perhaps you were aware of the headlines, mindfulness does not work for teens. And I think the study was excellent because even though it showed no results, it showed limitations of rushing to large randomized controlled trials and raised the question, should we do this universally everywhere and make teachers do it? And I think that approach, it has so much merit and it has drawbacks because it draws on a kind of medical model of testing the efficacy of things where sometimes we treat the treatment as a pill rather than, oh my God, we just asked these teachers to teach a new form of math, basically, called mindfulness. I mean, it would be like that. Okay, I want you to, without very much training, learn how to teach a new subject matter.
And perhaps it's not even the math teachers that you're asking to do that. It's the English teachers who, yeah.
Exactly. So, and what was great about the study is they could show that they know how much training they had. And the critiques of the study are available to say, was that the right approach to mandate and ask novice mindfulness practitioners to do this? So I think the most important finding from this for the whole field takes me back to the question of school reform. How do we do this in a way, implement these in a way that's authentic, scalable, sustainable, authentic? And is it scalable? I think that's a big question that's in the world. Could any teacher teach mindfulness to their? And I think there's a lot of skepticism about that. So I think the Myriad results, which showed no impacts, lots of money, made some people think, oh, we shouldn't be doing this. But of course, that's only one study, and it had some drawbacks. I think what it's pointing towards is the need for different approaches to implementing, maybe not thinking universally, but asking people who are engaged to do this. I think it's pointing in future directions rather than, I don't think we should throw it out or be upset with it. I think it was a great study.
Yeah, of
It
course.
showed the limitations of our thinking at this moment.
Yeah, absolutely. And you're right. There are so many ways to get mindfulness into schools. There's the apps where any teacher can press play and listen to a meditation recording at the beginning of their classes. There's the train the trainer models. There's the outside provider approaches. There's a wide spectrum when it comes to actually how much mindfulness practice in terms of minutes and hours is happening. Is there any research that has kind of compared different approaches to introducing mindfulness into schools?
Uh, It's a great question. And I was telling Sel and Ben, we're creating a new handbook on mindfulness, compassion, and education. And these two help me to think about how there are these different modalities of contemplative practice and education. There's technological ones, there's pedagogical ones, which is really where we've been. Technology, and either without teacher, we can run these programs through technologies, or we can have teachers implement them in the classrooms pedagogically. Then there's professional development, which we know kind of works for the teachers, although we haven't gotten to getting this work systematically into pre-service education, which might be a way to change the system. And then there's ecological approaches like whole school mindfulness, where you're really starting to think beyond programs and practices to whole school change in terms of the DNA, routines, and rituals of school life. How do we integrate this so that we're kind of mindful people here, and this is a mindful and compassionate community of learning? I think without knowing the evidence, there's a feeling among my friends that that whole school approach, the ecological approach, which in some ways can encompass the other approaches. We have to train the educators in the school in these practices if we want to implement them. We have to think about classroom implementation and how to support that. We have to think about, could technology play a role to bridge the practice component or the movement to home? I think that's where the field is going, to be honest. I think we want to move from individual therapeutic classrooms and practices and interventions to ecological ones where, again, it may not be the practices themselves that are the key drivers of change. It may just be, this is the way we do business here. And we start to form young people with those norms and values, as well as those skills in some way. This is my
Yeah.
sense of it. Yeah.
And thank you, Rob. I think that what you're talking about is so exciting as where the field is going. Obviously, these are the things that we're thinking about here at Whole School, but I'd love for you to talk a little bit about, a little more about what you're pointing to here in this moving away from and moving towards something. So you were naming, it will be, the field is kind of shifting its eye away from these sort of psychological, individualistic, even this sort of universal, secular, binary, effects oriented approach towards relational work, towards looking at mindfulness and as interactional, culturally diverse, and process oriented. In your 2022 study, one way you describe this is the distinction between mindfulness in education versus mindfulness as education. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yes, this was our the work of a friend of ours who's no more, Oren Orgas, who was a philosopher of education in Israel. And he really, so there are critiques of the work that are not just scientific. There are philosophic and pedagogical critiques of this being a kind of individualistic, therapeutic, from afar add-on program that in some ways could add burden to the work demands of the teacher. And to be honest, that's the prevention research model in some ways, that the programs are often developed from afar. They're not co-designed yet, and we're moving towards some sort of co-design, which I think is critical. The question then becomes, how do I implement this with high fidelity in a system? And then what are the effects? And that's a very powerful model. And it has these kind of assumptions and values implicit in it, like anyone could do this, like maybe we don't need to really care about where the pill gets administered because it's the pill that's the thing that works. It's not necessarily the ecology around the it comes from work comparing medicines to placebo effect. And Oren called that education, mindfulness in education. And he really wanted to contrast that medical prevention model, which should have development in it too, with what I would call a pedagogical or educational or developmental model, which was really about mindfulness as a way of life, as a way of knowing, as a way of being. not as a solution to my anxious and stressful mind, although it is that too. So how do we move towards a relational developmental view where this is a communal practice? This is something we learn from others, most of us. This is something
Mhm.
that's transmitted across experts to novices. This is something that's done together. This is a cultural practice that has to fit with the rest of the culture in which it's embedded. This is something that needs to be
Mhm.
thought about differently for a 5, 10, 15, and 20-year-old because they have different needs, values, and motivations. And, I think another question that the Myriad study raised is what is the motivation for any adolescent to want to do this? That's a developmental question. And I think it's a question that the field has not figured out. We really don't know what is the best way to implement these practices for adolescents where we can't assume the compliance of the young child and we can't assume the house is on fire of all of our lives, which is a motivation to do this. How do we think developmentally, relationally, ecologically about why adolescents in this place or that place would want this? So that's the kind of thinking I think we want to move towards: communal, social, and even the science, but also the practice.
Yeah, thank you for that. And, we have just under 15 minutes left, so we're going to get ready to start to bring in the voices of some of our community members here, and some of the questions that they're asking. And one that really feels really great to ask as a follow-up to what you're sharing, Rob, is this question about um, the strategies and approaches, not just like to get youth excited about this, but to get school leaders um,
Yeah.
excited about an ecological model, this sort of mindfulness as approach. Have there been any clues that you've been seeing in the research or anything that you've been hearing in the field about ways to get people collectively moving towards that direction?
Yeah, this is really one of the things I've realized, and maybe many of you do, is things happen over and over. And this is really a question of social change and strategies for engaging in systemic change. How does one do that? And, to be honest, and this goes for all of us, it may be that we need to go a little bit slow and I know the house is on fire, but I don't think you can pull the plant up and make it grow. I think you have to water it and tend it. And so therefore, I mean, one of the interesting critiques of the Myriad study is maybe we shouldn't be doing this universally. We should be going to places where there's already a desire and a demand for this and creating existence proofs of how, in those places where there's already a receptive mode of incorporation for mindfulness, do you do this work? Rather than, it's sort of like I think about when I go, I don't run, but if I did, I wouldn't go outside and start running up a hill, trying to work on the teachers who may not like this or are resistant, or that's all going to come. But maybe at the beginning, we want to put 1,000 lights on a hill.
Hmm.
Yeah.
As
Mhm.
opposed to reach 1 million people as quickly as possible in a different way. So, and I know this is a tension I fight with my colleagues all the time because we need to change things and there's an urgency, and yet there's a beauty and an authenticity and something precious here. So, to be honest, I don't know how to convince people who aren't convinced other than let's work with people who they would listen to as influencers who speak on behalf of this work. So start with there, lift that up through different methods, case studies, books, beautiful films, show this work, and let that be the attraction for others. I think small is beautiful in social change. Other people think big is the way. And I think it's very, very, very important. And I want to encourage all of you who are whole school directors, you have access to experiences and knowledge that the field needs, whether or not you consider yourself a researcher. You could imagine doing action. We would love to hear about these experiences you're having, because I think that's a prelude to all of the kind of more standardized and scalable science that we do. And I think the Myriad study has caused us to think we might need to go back and listen and learn a little more to think about in this next generation how to do this. So we want to remember we're talking, I think, in an educational context of an ethical way of being in the world and being present to the relations that sustain us and that created us. That how do we really become a full member, a full human being and a full member of our community for the good of all. And I think this is what we're trying to do together. This is why I love the idea that this group of people is committed to a generational and really probably global change in the way that we form hearts and minds in young people, with the hope that this is the one strategy for changing the trajectory that the world seems to be on around political polarization and ecological devastation and materialism, that there's those that we're trying to change that. So I just want to say thank you for having me, and thank you for all your work on this. And whatever forms of meditation you think are useful to doing that, please let's explore and create together, you know?
Yeah, thank you so much.